I'm very happy to contribute to this wonderful community with great thanks to Tom and Ian for inventing it and supporting us during the pandemic with the helpline. And I'm also happy to have the opportunity to just presenting you with a sort of a very incomplete accounting sheet of my debts to previous scholars. So I'm going to start from the beginning. The person who really introduced me to Herodotus in graduate school was Don Latiner. And at the time, he was in the process of writing his book. Here it appears in the paperback edition, The Historical Method of Herodotus. He taught me all sorts of stuff, how to take Herodotus seriously as an historian, how to count, for example, all the time that Herodotus says, I don't know. Although I did not know Caroline then, now, you know, she is probably the most passionate of all counters, I have to say. But anyway, when I was in graduate school, as I said, I wrote the dissertation on Herodotus. And this dissertation of mine was a very boring, at least to read, not to write, but to read, very formalistic work about transitions in Herodotus, by which I meant all the various introductory and concluding sentences that Herodotus uses to, you know, to articulate his narrative. And this sentence basically summarize in some way the narrative they identify. I'm just giving you a few examples. There is a limited number of these types of sentences, but I did not, already back then, I was convinced that they were like pockets of glosses that would in different ways reveal the history and isolate the voice of the history, as Caroline calls it, from all these various of other voices that occur in Herodotus. And I did not know at that time, I did not know anything about, I didn't even know how to distinguish verbally narrative from meta-narrative, I don't think. I did not know any narratology, but what I did have was this wonderful book that Don put in my hands by Henry Immerwahr. And he taught me all sorts of things. First, he taught me about the histories as an articulation of logoi by means of what he calls framing sentences, which is, by the way, my introduction and conclusion. He told me how to use patterning and analogy for interpretation. And he just drew attention to how broad Herodotus' system of explanation is, both synchronical across space and diachronical across time. And history is a method of understanding the world as a whole. And as a result of that, actually, because of his chapter on the earth, on the Greece, the east, and the west, he also taught me a much better view, a more subtle view of the polarity East and West, or Greeks versus non-Greeks. So in the years that divided my dissertation from the beginning of the work on my book, many years, when I was thinking about these introductory and concluding sentences, as I said, as pockets of Herodotus glosses, I became obsessed with the meta-narrative views of thuma. And I wrote a couple of articles on it at the time. And I remember that my first article was rejected several times, but one of the referees told me that I was interpreting Herodotus as if he were Pindar. Now, I don't know nothing about Pindar, but I just immediately, I still know nothing about Pindar, but I thought, well, maybe to this day, maybe I was right. Maybe we should be reading Herodotus the way we treat Pindar. everything was sort of like bubbling up at the time. I belatedly, for example, became more sophisticated in the field of narratology, initially through the work of critics of the modern novel, especially Gerald Prince, who used to teach at Penn. He has written many other works, but I'm just putting this up as an example. And also then from Irene de Jong, who applied the narratological theory to the field of classics, especially her book on Homer. Later, she wrote also she did some work on Herodotus and narratology, but I did not know about that. I sort of especially went on the book on Homer. And of course, we all know and we all benefit from Caroline Duval's 1987 article, which she discussed in this very forum, and who also sort of like in a way humanized Herodotus and made him look more like a real person with all these different aspects, the observer, the researchers, and this and that. So I had a lot of good guidance. Another book that absolutely became fundamental is Fornara's book on Herodotus, an interpretative essay, it's called. I cannot believe it. It's a 1971 book, but it seems to me that all of us, it took us a while to register it. I don't know, maybe it is only me. I mean, because I became aware of it in the 80s, but then it had a tremendous influence in, especially in its basic thesis that Herodotus' narrative of the past is informed by his and his audience's awareness of their present or present circumstances. And it's so, just as a proof that he continues to be incredibly influential. You know, in 2018, there came out Tom and Liz's collection interpreting Herodotus, so which is really quite recent. Now, however, Fornara, however, was very much influenced by Jacobi's developmental theory, to the point that he excluded all the ethnographies from this idea that they talk to the present. For him, the last three books are almost like a different project. And the ethnographies were not only written before that, but they were, you know, just that completely different concerns. And I cannot help noticing how many of the articles in the Harrison-Irwin collection still push back against this idea of excluding the ethnographies. I have to say that at the time, I also, the idea did not sit well with me. So what do we do with these ethnographies? I mean, they almost seem to be a completely different genre. So here are the people who helped me out with that. Of course, James Redfield's article has been reprinted numerous times. François Hartog, I mean, it's brilliant. Although I have to put it next to Caroline Duval's review, because there is an aspect of our talk that to me is difficult to countenance, and that is that everything that Herodotus does, like when it's not because it reflects really a sincere view of his world, but because the rhetoric of otherness is really a device with multiple artifices to bolster his own authority. And I'm sort of not in that camp. But aside from that, I mean, it gives fantastic ideas. And then, of course, there is Christopher Pelling's article that questions the polarity East and West. And I would like especially to mention Aldo Corcella's Herodoto e l'analogia, because he explains so well how Herodotus uses analogy both in his historical work and in his ethnographic work, and so that it sort of he taught me how to do that too. So what are we doing? I have to mention another thing that contributed to my thought on Herodotus, and that is Gregory Nagy Spinder's Homer. It's not a book on Herodotus, although it contains a good section on Herodotus. And his idea is that Homer, the message that Herodotus communicates through the histories is sometimes obscure. And the reason why it is obscure is because it is in the mode of the ionos. And we need ionos both in the sense of fable, like Aesopic fable, and in the sense that is used in Epinician poetry, both in the sense of praise, although praise is always mixed with some underlying blame in the form of a warning. And also the idea that this is a communication that it will be understood not by everybody. That some of them will and some of them not. So for Nagy, in other words, Herodotus' history is connected with the discourse of the ionos. So we have all these various approaches at different levels, narratology, patterning and analogy, the notion of Herodotus' work as a whole designed to teach Greek audiences of his time something about themselves, and the suggestion that this message is moralistic, almost prophetic, cautionary, and deliberately opaque. All these approaches has helped me in the exploration of what is the purpose of the history. Not that I've solved anything, but with this weird combination of narrative of the past and ethnography that sometimes seems to have these two genres sometimes seem to have little mutual functionality. So what is Herodotus' overarching message? And the first thing, and this is, I quote myself here, what is the basic relation between the ideological position that emerged from Herodotus' history of the conflict with the other and that which transpires through his description of multiple others? In those days, we used to use the word other a lot. I don't do that anymore. So the first thing that I needed to do was to revisit the distinction between narrative and meta-narrative in order to extract Herodotus, the voice of Herodotus' narrator. When the narrator speaks, what does he speak about? And he basically speaks about two things. He talks about his narrative, his logos, the organization, the length, where it comes from, his sources, whether they are reliable or not. And this is I call self-referential meta-narrative. And then he comments on the importance and meaning of facts on the ground, so to speak, facts in the real world, in the world of the narrated. And that's what I called referential meta-narrative. And I sort of tried to especially pay attention to the referential meta-narrative part. And the most important thing that sort of struck me, and I have a chapter devoted to it, is comparison. And this becomes sort of, I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but maybe I should just read what's on the screen. Comparison occurs when the Herodotus narrator says X is similar to or different from Y, where X and Y are either ethnographic phenomena, synchronic comparison, or historical events or ages, and that's diachronic comparison. Now, when we get to the ethnography, that is by definition the representation of difference. But when Herodotus says somebody is different from somebody else in explicit terms, he's really concerned in differentiating from within, as he does, for example, of the Ethnea that live near the Scythians, but he continues to say they're different. They're really not Scythian like you guys, Greek, or they use also call everybody Scythians. They have a different language. They have this other custom and so on. And on the other hand, assimilating comparisons in the ethnography, for example, this custom is like this other custom, are really numerous. And they point to important cross-cultural connection that suggest a unity of humankind. Sorry about, it's a little corny, this sentence. But anyway, they often belie also a strict polarity between Greek and non-Greek. And I have a chapter on Lydia and Scythia. In that chapter on comparisons, that to me, they demonstrate very much what is meant by the similarity of the other. And then you have diachronic comparison. Those assimilate historical events and actions belonging to different times and places. And this also underlines certain shared tendency of human behavior, and also detracts somewhat from the notion of Greek exceptionalism. For example, Herodotus says that Cleisthenes, the Athenian democratic reformer, imitated, he uses the verb mimeomai, his grandfather Cleisthenes of Sicyon. Now, his grandfather is a tyrant. So he belongs to the monarchical model, which is normally more associated with Eastern kings. So that you have this Cleisthenes of Athens that on the one hand is part of this autocratic heritage, but on the other hand, he's also the close ancestor of another democratic reformer, Pericles the Lion. The point that I wanted to make with this is that Herodotus gives us this explicit comparison, mimeomai, and that is a way of encouraging us to keep performing this operation again and again, even when it is not explicitly brought to light. The other type of meta-narrative sentence I was paying attention is that of interpretation of evaluation. Now, evaluation is simply when the narrator in his own voice says that something, this is good, this is bad, either from a moral, from a strategic, sensible viewpoint. Whereas in interpretation, the narrator gives his opinion on what a certain fact means. Now, in the historical narrative, evaluation and interpretation often intertwine. And we notice that blame tends to be less explicit and less direct in praise, as we would expect in the mode of the ionos. And by the way, this is something that drove Plutarch, the author of the Malignitate, nuts. But anyway, interpretation rather is about the importance or the causes or the motives of an event, and that is what predominates in the historical narrative. For example, at 7139, we have the so-called encomium of Athens. Of course, it is praise, right? But in fact, what it is, it's like a analysis of why it is that the Greeks were able not to succumb to the invasion of Xerxes. And in 720, this is like a parallel gloss of interpretation where he discusses Leonidas's motives. Yes, just on the one hand, he praises Leonidas, but on the other hand, he especially gives us Leonidas's mentality, the Spartan mentality in making his decision to stay at Thermopylae. Now, at the synchronic level, foreign customs and culture are sometimes explicitly praised. They are almost never explicitly criticized from an objective viewpoint. And so evaluation sort of predominates. Interpretation plays a lesser role, for the reason that Herodotus does not, very rarely tells us the reasons why people do certain customary things. You know, why do they burn the dead rather than bury them or rather than eating them? The most pervasive idea is in this exploration of difference is that differences across culture often amount to equivalencies, except for all this burning and eating the dead or burying the dead. They are, you know, they're all funeral. So Herodotus' position in the ethnography is one of cultural relativism, as he proclaims in the conclusion to the Cambyses narrative of 338. But this relativism has certain limits. In case of unacceptably oppressive and cruel nomoi. I mean, one of the very rare times in which Herodotus blames a nomos is when he says that Babylonian ritual prostitution is aiskistos, most shameful. There are few other places like that when explicit blame comes into being, where there is no understanding, okay, well, that is their way. And in that way, you know, funeral customs are easy because they don't hurt anybody, right? Everybody's already dead. But when there is a suspicion of oppression, he sort of shrinks back. Now, talking about interpretation and evaluation, 338 belongs to those statements where the narrator proclaims that something is true in general for all men, I should say whole human, but he actually uses sometimes pantes anthropoi, what Aristotle calls in the rhetoric calls a gnome. And now speakers in Herodotus generalize all the time, often in contradictory ways. So it is especially important to separate them from the narrator's generalization that are fairly limited in number and rather coherent. They express moral truth that because they are in the present of the economic eras, they often have force for now, they have force of warning for the present, for his audience today. And obviously we cannot take these generalizations of Herodotus as a distillation of his philosophy, right? Because we have to analyze them in comparison to his narrative and also in comparison to, in dialogue to the generalizations of his other speakers. And so I just made sort of a list just to tell you how few there are, really. You have a bunch about that talk about the instability of fortune. I mean, that's the only one that talks in general terms about the instability of fortune, but that's a very big theme in the narrative. Why is fortune unstable? Well, because when you are rich, you are more likely to transgress, and for great injustices, there are also the punishment of the gods are great, the timoria are great. On the other hand, vengeful acts by humans that are excessively violent are for the gods' cause of resentment. I find this very interesting because he uses the word epiphthanoi, which is the only time that Herodotus talks about the thonos of the gods. And to me, that separates Herodotus' position from the Solonian position to Crassus, who says that the gods, generalizes that the gods are the god is ptoneros kai tarakodes, of ptoneron kai tarakodes. I remember whether he uses, I forget whether he uses the neuter or not. That's really not Herodotus. What the gods are resentful about are transgressions, excessive transgression, very often caused by self-aggrandizement. And then we have a bunch, why did I do that? A bunch of divine communication, because there is a difference between communication and intervention. Especially there is one that we have talked about several times in this forum, 877, in which he says he cannot say against others that oracles are not truthful. Very complicated statement. He talks on Athenian democracy, on government, and here he takes a sophistic stance in the sense that he gives an argument, at least his narrative gives an argument why democracy is a kremas pudaion, a really good thing, because the citizens behave more courageously in war because it's about their city, they are masters of themselves. But then on the other hand, when Aristagoras comes to Athens and they are deceived into participating in the Ionian revolt, he says, well, in this case, maybe the rule of many is not conducive, so conducive to good decision. He has a very unambiguous position about war. He says that internal struggle is a greater evil than a war fought in agreement, just as war is a greater evil than peace. And when he means by stasis is not so much inside a city, the stasis inside the city, but simply the Greeks with each other, that fighting with the Greeks, fighting with each other is worse than a war that is a necessary war of defense fought against a foreign power. And that is obviously very, very cogent for his own times. And then he talks about intercity disputes. Herodotus, especially in book 7, brings up all these various quarrels about people having different opinions of who did what, whether they joined the alliance of the Greeks, whether they behaved well in battles and so on. And there is one generalization of Herodotus in which he sort of justifies the Argives for what seems to be a little sketchy behavior at the time of the Persian Wars, according to rumors, by saying, well, the Argives, like everybody else, people, or pantes anthropoi, consider their own wrongdoings, or keia kaka, preferable to those of others. I find this very interesting because it is sort of parallel. This is in the historical narrative. There are not very many generalizations that are moralistic in the ethnographies, right? But the one there is at 338 is parallel. It's almost as if he had borrowed the relativistic position and applied it to the historical position. Everybody has his own arguments. Everybody thinks that their customs are better than those of others. And then this, in turn, this ethnographic generalization goes hand in hand with the one about religion, that all religion are alike. There is absolutely no point in discussing the various myths, except when he's really has to for reason of his narrative. Okay, so that's it. So why don't I? Okay, so what we end up with is that the moralistic side of Herodotus comes out more when he does history, with his hostility towards aggression, especially wars of choice. He says that they constitute injustice. I mean, not in his generalizations, but throughout this narrative, remember that he asks who was the first to commit injustice against the Greeks, and that was Chrysocle. I use the word adikemata. The idea is that autocratic rulers or aspiring autocratic rulers are especially prone to aggression, and that power corrupts. So the monarchical model, in a way, is the limiting case of leadership. All leadership is dangerous. Even a Spartan king who is not a real monarch, or a general, anybody who is in power has special opportunities to abuse this power, and they normally do. And they, and this sort of category of leaders, from kings to public officials, is cross-cultural. In a way, they have their, in a way, they almost come to the point where they have their own nomoi that disagree or violate the nomoi of the community. And on the ethnographic side, where he's relativistic, although with certain limits, as we've seen, the idea is that culture is culture is common to everybody, but it's fragmented into different cultures and their customs, most of them legitimate and worthy of respect, and that a community's custom should be sharply distinguished from the behavior and attitudes of the community's leaders. Because, as I said, they sometimes they don't have the same respect for nomos. And I would say that I'm sure that there is a lot more work to be done about the function of the ethnographies, but to me, this separating the community from the kings in this narrative that is largely regocentric is one of the most important function. What else do I have? Maybe nothing. Oh, this is what I'm going to end with, because this is how I end my book. And that is with a chapter on thuma, my old preoccupation. See, what kind of contribution do these thomata make to the whole message of Herodotus? Actually, I sort of had this idea, I don't know whether I subscribe to it anymore, maybe it was a little too rigid, that thuma is a real marker. I mean, Herodotus has many advertisements of narratability. He says, this is the first, this is the best, this is the biggest, and therefore worthy of being narrated, worthy of logos and so on. But the idea is that when he says thuma, the phenomenon jumps at you, because there are a limited number of cases, and it corresponds to the promise in the first sentence. And they are a unifying category, because there are historical thomata and there are ethnographic thomata. In the sphere of ethnography, there was a tradition, evidently, of thoma writing. There was evidently a constituency, a readership, or an audience for learning about strange things that foreign people do. But actually, Herodotus, or strange phenomena of foreign lands, Herodotus actually pushes against it, in the sense that what he chooses very often, yes, he has the conventional big buildings and amazing monuments. But if you just look at the description, for example, of the funeral monument of Aliates, which is defined as the only thoma that the Lydian land has, because otherwise Lydia is fairly the same as Greece, you will see that in his description, it is built by different strata of lower classes, that is merchant, craftsmen, and prostitutes. And so you have this idea of these common people in this supposedly very luxurious Lydian culture, but this is not a luxurious description, who basically just pay for the tomb of their king very passively in this oppressive monarchy of the Myrmidons, for which we have had only a glimpse that was not bad in the figure of Croesus. And then, of course, I could not, on the historical side, I could not talk about Orion, which is a mise en abîme, basically, of the whole work, although a lot of articles have come up about Orion. And then I put the story of the Alcmeonidae flashing the shield after marathon because Tom Harrison had a presentation on it. And the interesting thing about this is that Herodotus says it's really a wonder to me that they would say that about the Alcmeonid. And then he just goes into a whole fake demonstration, ironical demonstration, how it couldn't possibly be that the Alcmeonid have any interest in tyranny of any connection with the tyrants. And then the other one that I chose, maybe because I haven't talked about it too much, you know, there is Artemisia, of course, but is the oracle in Carian from Toian Apollo to a Carian emissary of Mardonius. We don't even know what the oracle is about or what he was asked. All we know is that the oracle starts speaking. He was actually consulted by the Thebans, who were supposed to act as interpreters, and the Thebans don't understand a word of what the oracle say. They Miss sort of, I think, grabs the tablet and starts writing furiously because the god speaks in his own tongue, and which is sort of like the universality of the divine that you can even encounter in a culturally specific sanctuary, such a Greek sanctuary. And the reason why, as another example, I've the Egyptian labyrinth. This is that is considered very. This is the one thuma that is very self-referential, in my opinion, because I would like to actually, if it's okay with you, to read in the translation of Waterfield and with the commentary of Caroline DeWalt in the Oxford, because this is what he says. The labyrinth has rooms on two levels, an underground level and an above ground level on top of it. And there are 3,000 rooms in all, with each level containing 1,500. I myself went through the ground level rooms and saw them. And so I speak from first-hand knowledge. But the underground ones were only described to me. The Egyptians who are in charge of the labyrinth absolutely refused to show the underground rooms on the grounds that there lie the tombs of the kings who originally built the labyrinth and those of the sacred crocodiles as well. So as far as the underground rooms are concerned, I can only pass on what I was told, but the upper rooms, which I personally saw, will seem almost superhuman edifices. For instance, the corridors from chamber to chamber and the winding passages through the courtyard are so complicated that they were a source of endless amazement. We would pass from a courtyard to, whoever they are, we would pass from a courtyard to some rooms, and from the rooms to colonnades, from where we would move on to the other chambers and then find ourselves back in a different set of courtyards. I mean, on the one hand, this labyrinth is like Egypt itself, incredibly confusing, partially to be known and partially mysterious and not to be known. And Herodotus is not mentioning only because it's such a big building in a conventional way, probably of automatas, but because it is his thuma. It is his thuma. It's like his logos, you know. And so this is, I would like to leave you with that. I don't know that each one of these cases needs to be sort of like analyzed in its own way of the many thumata, and sometimes you run the risk of overinterpretation. But that, to me, is one of the most important, you know, things in Herodotus. Thank you very much.